welcome to BJJ Mental Models, episode 93. I'm Steve Kwan.
I'm Matt Kwan.
BJJ Mental Models is your guide to a conceptual and intelligent jiu-jitsu approach. And this week, we've got another very, very special guest, also from Island Top Team, Cal McDonald. Cal, how you doing?
I'm doing pretty well, thank you. Thanks for having me on, guys.
Welcome to the show.
No worries. It's actually something we've wanted to do for a long time. And of course, now that we've got you on the podcast, Cal, we have had all of the Island Top Team black belts on our show. So we have a complete set. As a collector, I find this to be a very big achievement.
Awesome.
So no, actually, the reason why we've wanted to have you on the show for quite a while is because we wanted to talk about working with kids. Now, Matt and I are relatively new parents. And I mean, as anyone who listens to the podcast knows, you know, we talk about our daughters and in Matt's case, our son quite often. And we've always wanted to do like specific episodes on parenthood or working with kids. But this is an area that you specifically specialize in addition to, from what I understand, managing the Island Top Team kids classes, you're also heavily involved in helping to kind of create the framework that you guys put up on the bjjconcepts.net website, especially as it comes to pedagogy for kids. So we wanted to have someone on here who's really got a lot of experience on the topic, and I couldn't think of anyone better. So thank you very much for attending here.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much. I am really excited to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have Cal on the show, and you know, I've rolled with Cal numerous times, and he's very good. Competes on the larger side compared to hobbits like Steve and I. What are you, Cal? Like 200 pounds?
I'm about 200 pounds. We'll say 200 today. I might be pushing that a little bit, but we'll leave it at 200.
Right on. Yeah, and I know Cal's a really good instructor, and I know you know, he's doing really awesome stuff. Rob always tells me, speaks very highly of how Cal is handling the kids' classes, and this is going to be a great chat, I think, so I'm excited.
Yeah. So, Cal, why don't you kick this off? Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and how this became such a passion for you and how you wound up taking ownership of this program at Island Top Team?
Absolutely. So, I started training at Island Top Team about 7 years ago now. And when I got to a higher blue belt level, I really decided that I wanted to get into teaching. I recognized that it was a huge passion of mine to teach, but I was also super fascinated, as many are, with the system that Rob introduced me to, obviously the alignment and concept-based system. So I was talking to Rob, and I essentially said, dude, you know, I'd love to start coaching. And basically the idea was I wouldn't be coaching until I was essentially a brown belt. So at the time, there was no kids program at Top Team. And realistically, what made me start sort of that endeavor was that I wanted experience coaching. And I recognized there was a hole there, and it was kind of a perfect fit. I was really interested in just learning how to learn. That's always been a big fascination of mine. Mm-hmm. And then applying that to teaching. So that's really how the program started. We began with about, 10 or so students at the time. And I just sort of started rolling. I wanted to create a program that took the adult concepts, or the way we taught the adult class, and format that for kids. And it's definitely been a bit of a journey, but now I've got a pretty good system, a pretty solid system that takes into account learning strategies. So from cognitive sciences or educational sciences, I use these strategies along with various BJJ concepts, and then a bunch of mini games and the way we structure class and that kind of thing. So I'd love to just basically break all that down for you, and you can take from it whatever you can.
I sure will too, because I'm always teaching kids as well at the school. At least I haven't been since the pandemic started. We're actually starting again next week with kids, but I'm definitely curious to see how you apply Rob's concepts to the kids class, because Rob's told me that he has covered kids class, you know, a rare amount of times when you can't make it. And he says that it's basically like teaching adults. Like, all the kids have an understanding of basic and even some more advanced mechanics and concepts and principles and things that sort of sets our system apart from other systems where it's just, you know, teaching moves to kids and they just regurgitate moves. It's more focused on the why things work and how they work.
Absolutely. Yeah. I try to keep it. I, of course, still have to teach techniques and moves, but I try to keep those really simple, and very frequently I'm just going over the concepts. So let me start with one learning strategy. And I'm sure you guys have gone over these things before, and I'm sure a lot of the people listening have heard of these strategies, but I'll just break them down just briefly. So the most important strategy is absolutely retrieval. There's a bunch of different names for these things. Retrieval's synonymous with recall. The basic idea is you want your students to have to pull things out of their own mind. So rather than like a lecture format or constantly reminding a student of what they should do, you want to have that student recall something that you previously have taught them, right? And effort goes hand in hand with this retrieval concept. So you don't want students retrieving something from their mind that's particularly easy to retrieve. So if we cover something in one class, if this is a fairly experienced student, then the following class, I might not touch on that material because it'll just be too easy for them to recall that information. So I'll wait, however long it might be, and that's a bit of an art, to then recall whatever information it is I want those students to bring back to their short-term memory. All right. So this idea of retrieval is absolutely at the forefront of the concepts that I use, and effortful retrieval is kind of the name of the game.
Interesting, because when we've talked about similar strategies earlier on the podcast, we've talked about the importance of spaced repetition as a learning strategy for adults, right?
Yes.
Where as you progressively repeat the learning process and revisiting material you've already seen, you space it out so that further and further and further,
Absolutely.
You widen the gap so that people have to wait a while before they come back and they go through that retrieval exercise again, just to keep the connection strong.
That's exactly.
And that kind of sounds like the way you've described it.
Yeah, actually, there's a really neat analogy that I read. I think it was in the book Make It Stick, which is a phenomenal book on modern learning strategies. And the analogy kind of works like this. Hopefully I get this down the way that they say it, but you're essentially in a forest. So you picture yourself in a very dense forest. I'm going to imagine that you're near a lake in this dense forest, so some kind of a landmark. And then you want to travel to some area of the forest. By traveling there, you create a path. So you're, whacking down bushes and choosing a particular path. If you travel back and forth between that path, obviously that path is more well-worn. And you're going to know how to get from where you were to that point. Now, in the idea of retrieval, if you have a student retrieve something, so if you ask them a question and don't give them the answer, they have to go through that process of going from where they are in that forest to finding that answer in their own mind. If you give them the answer, it shortcuts that circuit and they just appear at that destination and they're not forming that pathway. So I find that analogy is really useful.
So you're basically teaching how to learn. You're not spoon feeding them the answers. You're kind of teaching them a way so that they know how to find the answers through problem solving and recalling information that you've given them.
Definitely the goal, for sure.
That's nice. So it's like almost like you're teaching them how to fish type thing.
Yeah, absolutely. You could totally use that analogy.
Yeah. I really like how you said, because again, I relate to, a lot of what you're talking about, just being part of my job as well, how you're saying, keeping it really basic, like the techniques that you teach, because with kids, so easily when you're watching kids roll or compete, unless they're super high level, there are kids out there that are just phenomenal and they have really good understanding of jiu-jitsu, or they're just have really good coaches, or maybe they're just super naturally good. It's so often that you see just like a scramble fest, there's no concepts, there's no strategies. It's just like just an all out crazy roll. But yeah, it's like a fine line, because you do want to teach them the concepts, but at the same time, you need to teach them moves, because if they don't have moves, then there's no jujitsu. So it's
exactly.
Like, where do you sort of start? Because I find that kids only have so much cognitive load available, like their focus bandwidth, is it can only go so far, especially when you have a class that's an hour or even 45 minutes. We used to do 45-minute classes here, and then we extended it to an hour just because a 45-minute class just goes by so fast. And, you want to cover material, you want it to stick and give the kids new tools while reinforcing the old tools, but you also need to let them roll so that they can actually try it out. So I guess, how do you sort of decide the balance between concepts and teaching techniques? And when you say keep it simple, are you thinking like one technique a class, or like a 2 technique per class? How do you sort of space that out?
I can definitely get into this. So let's start from, if I started from someone's first class, okay? And this is something I've done so many times because of new students just across the board. So let's say we have a student start in a knee ride position, okay? So I put someone in knee ride position. One of the reasons I chose the knee ride was because on a kid's first day, if you have them mount another student, they're kind of like, what the hell am I getting into? So I choose the knee ride. It's a little more impersonal. So they're on top and they manage their center of gravity. So I basically explain center of gravity. If there's some kind of glaring issue, like their posture is absolutely horrible, their base is, just not right at all, I'll correct those little things, but related back to, I'll get into some more learning strategies later so I can relate to why I do these things. But basically, we'll start them in the knee ride position and have them learn what their center of gravity is and where their base is. So the bottom player, without any knowledge, will just start moving around while keeping their structure, their elbows tight. They'll start moving around and trying to displace the top player. They're trying to manipulate the top player's center of gravity. So we have a tiny mini game that involves the top player keeping their balance on the top of knee ride. All right. And the bottom player has worked on they just have an idea of the structure, right? So a very small amount of information. You talked about cognitive load, which is something I really use very frequently. So we have a destination now. We have the knee ride. Now we can move into a pass. All right. Maybe a pass or potentially an escape for the bottom player. So the bottom player could learn how to bump the player in knee ride and then hip escape, or we can move into passing where the top player now has a destination and they learn a basic Toriando pass, for example. So some kind of side-to-side movement, very basic, where they're framing the knees and they're moving left or right and trying to end up in that knee ride position. Then we add in some kind of basic frame mechanism for the bottom player, and we have them understand frames. Maybe we touch on range, but likely just, look, you want to face the player on top and you want to frame the top player. Maybe I'll add frame the leading edge. But once I add in the leading edge, this is a little bit of extra information. Maybe I'm judging that this particular student should go with the simple, just frame. Don't even maybe I won't even mention to face, likely I'd mention to face their training partner, but either way, minimal amount of information. And if I can just expand on this for a second, now they'll play a bit of a game involving guard retention and passing so that they have that knee ride as a hub. Then from the knee ride, we might teach a very simple back take. We might teach a really simple tripod sweep at some point, and a very simple engagement phase sort of hand fight. So I'm pretty sure I touched on everything. We have sweeping, passing, retention, back takes, engagement phase, and then a escape from the back. Like a very basic hand fight, get your back to the mat. And so now we have a game. And essentially from that point, I just manage the cognitive load. I use different tools to introduce new material, and eventually that game evolves into at least 2 options, but maybe 3 or 4 options from certain positions.
Yeah, so incrementally you start small with a position, and then you essentially it's almost like you're mapping a system, and over time sort of incrementally adding, new variables, new reactions, and sort of, help them sort of map their way through the neon belly in this case. Because we've all had, those of us who teach kids regularly, it's like, if you've never done it before, it can be pretty interesting because you can tell when you've kind of broken the kids' brains, when you've overloaded them with information, and then they just literally shut down. It's like they're just like, oh God, now I'm afraid to make a mistake. I don't know what I'm doing. So I just, they don't make good decisions. But I think keeping it simple is one of the most valuable tools when it comes to teaching kids, because you are, in some kind of form, I kind of look at it as, you are teaching beginners, right? But they're beginners who have extremely low attention spans and high energy, and they may not be as confident as some, grown-ups. I mean, of course, there are adults who don't have the confidence that they will get through lots of jiu-jitsu training, but definitely keeping it simple, I think, is one of the most valuable things. It's like, I realize when I teach kids, maybe after a week, when I first started teaching kids, I'm like, okay, it's very obvious to me that less is more at this point, and let's keep it simple.
Yeah, I love that you brought that up because, we've talked about incremental learning on the podcast before, where as a black belt, a lot of the time you kind of view the world through the lens of a black belt, and you don't remember what it was like the first time you saw a position or a technique, right? Because all of those details are so ingrained in your habits now that you don't even have to think about them. And so the mistake that I think a lot of instructors make is they kind of give all of the details to the student at once, and they won't rest until the the student knows all of the details. So they'll keep coming by and correcting them every 2 seconds. Oh, your arm's out of place. Oh, now your knee's out of place. But that isn't always really productive because you kind of have to spoon feed details, give them the core details they need to understand why they're doing what they're doing. And eventually let them do it. Eventually they'll hit a wall and they won't know what the next thing to do is. And that's when you can kind of come in and help them. But if you just overload them with all of the details at first, then it kind of makes the brain shut down. And that happens in adults. And I can only imagine it happens much worse in children.
Yeah, you can't sit down a kid on their first class. Typically, there are exceptions, and just start talking about alignment and, teach them from that perspective. Like, I have to get them into play as quickly as possible, and a form of play that isn't too daunting. I don't want to start them in a rear naked choke and just say, all right, give her, and try to escape. And so that's why I find the knee ride is kind of an appropriate starting point.
Well, that's actually a really good point, which is just the intimidation factor. I mean, even for adults, jiu-jitsu is really intimidating. And I think a lot of people, I count myself among these people, really, really hesitate to start training because they're so scared of the idea. But once they've done it for a while, most people kind of realize, this wasn't as bad as I thought. But when you're a kid, this kind of stuff, in addition to the fact that you're kind of in an adult's world, it's kind of scary. It is a very, very close contact combat sport. And when you've got someone sitting on top of you, especially if they're a lot bigger than you, it can really scare you and put you off. And what you've described here is a really interesting and I think good way to introduce kids, which is to pick a position or an idea that really illustrates the art. It's a very important thing to understand, but it's not intimidating. And start with that and then gradually help them increase their comfort level.
Yeah.
And Cal, I wanted to get your opinion because a lot of the time when I was coming up through the ranks under my first instructor, there would be lots of movement drills. And I know that a lot of Rob's teaching, and especially when you have a room full of, experienced guys, they don't want to be spending the first 20 minutes doing like line drills, movement drills, things like that. But when it comes to beginners and kids, I find those drills to be really useful because the kids learn how to move. They basic household moves like shots and sprawls and, like rolls and shrimping and stuff like that every grappler needs to know. I find, at least for the junior kids, it's really important to sort of ingrain those movements so that at least they can try it, they can fail, and then they can sort of see how to make things better and keep focusing on those fundamental movements. Whereas, if you're teaching, like I said, you got high level guys, they're probably not going to want to do that. They're going to want to get right to drilling or working on specific material.
Yeah. So there's this concept called Schmidt's schema theory for motor learning. Basically, what it entails is you have a generalized motor program, so just the broad strokes of a particular movement, and then the schema includes a feedback loop of the repetitions that you've put in on that particular movement. An example would be like in tennis, like you have a backhand, for instance. That's your generalized motor program. And then every time you use that backhand movement, you're calibrating it more particularly to novel situations. Prior to schema theory, the idea was you'd create a specific movement pattern for every single movement you do. Okay, so this is the idea that you have a gross movement pattern, a generalized motor program, and then you refine it given particular feedback. And so relating to what you're saying with the kids, yeah, like it's pretty frequent. I wouldn't say frequent, but sometimes I'll have the kids do solo movements. If I see them try do a particular movement, like something really basic, like a bridge, for instance, and I recognize, okay, there's no way this kid's going to be able to do a bridge, particularly with another kid on top of them, then in that case, I'll show just the bridge by itself. We might move into the hip escape. We might even do, high legs against the wall, for instance. If a kid's having a hard time breaking down the movement with a training partner, we'll start repping that generalized motor program in a different context, so solo, and then we'll introduce it back into them training with their training partner.
Yeah, I like that idea of doing the solo drills first. And I find that when you do that, it's kind of, they're not really relying on the reaction of the other partner because that their uke, who is maybe like, helping them do that drill, they may be so new that they don't even understand
exactly
how to apply the proper reaction, right?
Exactly.
So that's where solo drills can really, I think, skip that headache. And I love the idea of using the wall when you're working with kids.
Yeah.
I think that like the high legs against the wall and wall walks and, even for the more senior kids, when we start to teach things like inversions, the wall can become really useful rather than just trying to do it on a straight line. I wanted to get your opinion because, and again, this is no knock to you guys or at Island Top Team, but I mean, you guys aren't really like known for stand-ups exchanges. Like you're not like wrestlers by trade, pretty homegrown jiu-jitsu style, lots of guard pulling, and we're the same way at On Guard too. But I find that when you get kids in the room, wrestling is something that they pick up so quickly, and it's
100%.
just something about wrestling is just so natural for kids. And I really gravitated my junior kids, at least, especially the junior kids, but a lot of the seniors as well. As I like to focus on wrestling because I feel like it gives them a good understanding of base, and also I feel like it can boost confidence if they understand. Okay, like I'm going to be comfortable on my feet now, and I understand that there is going to be transitions from standing to the ground, and if they're going to compete, then that's just going to be the reality of the situation. Something about wrestling is just so natural for kids that that is something that I focus on. I just wanted to get your opinion on that.
I find that, like you said, the kids, they really just enjoy wrestling. So I definitely like to teach wrestling, definitely like to teach stand-up. You could say I have a bit of a fear of teaching kids jiu-jitsu and then them ending up in a situation. It's unlikely, but that they would have to defend themselves physically and then not having the right tools to do that. So I absolutely need these students to feel comfortable on their feet, hand fight from their feet, snap down, double leg, some basics.
Yeah, and that way I think, it really adds value to their training. Not just like we're trying to win medals here where I can just pull guard, but like you said, in a real situation, if a kid gets into an altercation and they have to use their grappling, it's like, well, if you have wrestling, you already have such a fantastic base in a self-defense situation. And I think the parents see a lot of value in that too, because, the last thing I would want one of my kids to do in a fight would be just sit on their butt, right? In a competition, yeah, sure, because the rules, the win conditions allow it. But in a self-defense situation, like I want my kids to be able to like clinch up and not fall over and have some base under their feet.
Yeah.
It's funny you mention that because I remember Dave Camarillo talking about wrestling versus judo. And he was talking about how if he wants to get someone up to speed in an MMA fight and that he wants to get them a good grappling game on their feet, he's going to teach them wrestling because there's something just intuitively natural about it. And even after you've just been training it for a little while, you can get value out of it. Whereas with something like judo, to get to the point where you could really use it in a high level fight, like you might have to train it for 10 years. And I remember this too from when I was in school. There's just something that is intuitively natural about wrestling that you just don't see in a lot of other arts like jiu-jitsu. Like, I mean, I love jiu-jitsu. You can't argue with the effectiveness of jiu-jitsu, but it's real complicated, right? Whereas wrestling has this beautiful simplicity to it. And I think that makes it especially useful for kids because it's just so intuitive.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Like jiu-jitsu is so complex at times, like some positions, even you take the most basic, talk about like an arm bar from guard or a Kimura. It's like, dude, you could go down rabbit holes for a long time talking about how it works, why it works, different reactions you're going to get and different places you can go with an arm bar from guard. It's like, but wrestling, it's like, okay, just, we got to get our opponent down to the ground. Let's talk about clinching. Let's talk about underhooks. Let's talk about snap downs, and it's like, it's real basic. Show the scoop singles, show a double leg, show a sprawl. And like, before you know it, you've already got more material than like one class can allow. So there is something beautifully simple and effective about wrestling. I think it's one of the best bases for kids when they begin their grappling journey.
Absolutely. And just as another tool, I mean, it's essential in my mind for a complete grappler, but as another tool to provide the same concepts we're always teaching in a slightly different context. So it's just another opportunity to review posture, structure, base, and all those things.
Yeah, and then they can see those concepts, because from my kids, I don't know if I would explain the entire alignment theory in one class. I think that's a lot of material. But you could explain like, okay, let's talk about posture today. Why do you have grandma and grandpa telling you should, you should stand up straight with your shoulders back. It's like they might not even think about that. Maybe it's just because they think it's the proper way to position themselves. But then you go in and you explain, well, when you position your spine in a manner where it's most effective, you're going to be stronger. You're going to be less vulnerable to attack. Even in a social setting, you're going to have people that, you make better first impressions. They think that it portrays confidence and courage and all those things that are really important outside of jiu-jitsu. So it's like, when they leave, they're going to think, okay, well, like I'm going to consider the position of my spine, especially. And then you can say, oh, well, this is not just for jiu-jitsu. This is for every physical exertion. And for, when you go and meet friends for the first time, or meet a teacher, or you have to talk to a grown-up, that's something that they're going to see and say, oh, wow, like that, I really see how you're carrying yourself.
Exactly. That touches on the idea of the learning strategy of elaboration. So just connecting jiu-jitsu to other things that they already know, talking about alignment in terms of other sports that they might play. And just to make it clear, like when I teach class, I mean, obviously we know the framework as instructors, but it's almost as if I have a word bank of 50 words that, includes obviously alignment and all of our concepts. And I just use those words very frequently. I don't expect that the kids are going to put it all together. Man, I mean, it took me years to even begin to really understand how these concepts work. It's kind of a weird perspective now that I really have a solid grasp on those concepts, but it takes time, so I'm definitely not trying to have them understand really any given concept in a single class. Maybe they touch on it, and then one day they're like, oh, wow, I totally understand what you've been talking about this whole time.
Right.
Yeah, it's funny. You kind of have to feel it before you can understand it. And this is something that we talked to John Thomas about recently. And he actually is not like a big fan of learning with principles. He kind of prefers getting his hands dirty with techniques, which I thought was a really interesting approach. So I was asking him about it. And the thing that kind of came away from this conversation was that the problem with just thinking with like your head in the clouds is that you need real world experience to anchor those frameworks onto. Like the way that I would describe it is, and this is something that is very recent and relevant to me, when you're teaching a toddler how to start speaking, you don't sit them down when they're 1 year old and be like, okay, honey, here's how grammar works. Here's what a noun is. It's like, no, you just start making sounds and eventually they start repeating them and eventually they start putting them together. And one day they got words, and that's when they start asking questions. Then you explain, okay, well, honey, this is what an animal is. This is, and then eventually they learn bigger and bigger concepts like grammar and reasoning, but it's very hard to learn those high level concepts without having your hands in the dirt first so that you know what's being talked about. And that's something that I think sometimes, I mean, we talk a lot about mental models and principles on the show, but those are not a substitute for actually getting your hands dirty. And I think that any concept-based approach is well served by getting the student to try something first and hit that point of frustration. And then you can start helping them get the light bulb 100%. To turn on, because they can start to see the pattern between the things that they've already done.
It's funny. I have a number of learning strategies, and then my final learning strategy, I don't really have a name for it, but it's essentially what you said. It's this idea that we are learners. Humans are learners. It's an innate thing that we have in us. It's how we've come to where we are now. And so you have to understand that basic fundamental process of learning. Kids can just watch what you're doing, and they'll just sort of mirror that. So I think that's just a phenomenal point. It's so important that just like a kid learning to speak or walk, it's the exact same thing. And you have to sort of introduce someone at that rate. You can't just drop everything on them on day one and expect that they're going to put it all together. I really like to draw a line between, concepts and techniques. Techniques are brilliant representations of concepts. It's kind of hard to separate the two.
Mm-hmm. You're right. Like, I think you definitely just have to some degree, you got to just let the kids kind of go at it, and let them. I find one of the biggest mistakes that I made at the beginning was I was constantly correcting, and this is true for adults as well. If you're just as an instructor constantly correcting because things aren't going, as particular students aren't drilling or performing techniques the way that you would like them to do them, and then you're constantly in their ear correcting them, again, you kind of get that same effect on the student where they kind of just break down and they're not able to focus the same manner. Whereas if you let them fail and then they can see the consequences of their mistakes, and then after you can talk to them and be like, okay, like you see how you got past there? Well, that happened because of this, rather than like stopping them right when they're doing something and always giving them that feedback. Like I think it's good to give feedback consistently, but definitely if you're going like always just constantly correcting, then it kind of, you get a negative return on that.
Yeah. For example, when a kid is particularly new, if they turned their back to their training partner in some given situation, that's something I will absolutely say, okay, look, never turn your back in this situation. And similar, if they are just falling over very easily, I'll address something like that. It'll be like, look, if a student's hip just keeps hitting the mat over and over again, this is a really, like a major mistake that we need to fix really early on. So yeah, like I'm definitely not just being like, look kids, like this is alignment, this is base posture structure. Like I absolutely do not start like that. It's more so face your training partner, and then build from there. And then maybe 6 months in, well, no, that's not true. Maybe 6 weeks in, I'll ask a question and one of the kids will be like, oh, that's because your posture's broken,
Yeah, it's like you said at the beginning of this episode, you can't shortcut the journey. Like your job is not to give them the end result. Your job is to guide them so that they take the journey successfully on their own. And a big part of learning is guiding them to the point where they get frustrated with the limits of their own knowledge and they're ready for the next lesson. And I remember having this experience at my first gym, which was very much an old school technique based gym where they didn't really seem to care that much about what was going on in your noodle. Like they just wanted to basically give you all of the steps to do the move. And you'd have the instructor sitting there barking at you the whole time. Like, no, your elbow's out of position. Oh no, now your knee's out of position. And it's just a litany of minor details to the point that as the student, it's hard to actually tell, like, okay, do all of these details really matter? Like, what are the things that really matters? And something that we've talked about on the podcast is this thing that Matt brought up, this concept of critical control points, which is that, like, for some moves, there's maybe a few details that really matter. And those are the ones you got to make sure your students really, really understand. Yeah. But a lot of the other stuff you can kind of freewheel depending on the context. But at the end of the day, like there's a few things that are really big enough that it's worth correcting people. But a lot of the little things, you got to let it slide until the student gets a bit more experience.
Yeah. And I feel like, when you're showing techniques to kids and they're drilling a move or whatever, it's also really important as the instructor to realize that, like, hey, if a leg is out of position or a knee is out of position, it's not really good feedback to be like, okay, just move your left knee inside their armpit, because they're going to literally use their right leg and they're going to do the complete opposite of what you ask, right? Like a lot of kids don't even know their lefts and rights yet. Even adults, they come in, even though they know their lefts and rights for the most part. If you say like, okay, put your right foot inside here. If you use your words to do that, very rarely do you get beginners that can actually like move and in the way that you're instructing. So it's actually a tip that I kind of picked up, not that I've studied the Gracie University thing, but I know that I have a friend who does study that, because they do have like essentially a pedagogy section where they talk about instruction and instructing beginners. And they say, when it comes time to tell a student, and I assume whether it's beginner or I assume this applies for kids as well, and you have to say, okay, like put your arm here, instead of saying it, they literally grab the arm and they put it into the position rather than just using words. It could save some headache too, because otherwise you might just be like giving 3 different commands before you finally get something you want, or you might have to be physical anyways and move their arm to the specific position. So it's like, I thought that was a pretty good tool as well when it comes time to showing positions.
I came across that too, and definitely, at least pre-COVID, was using that all the time. I think they call it like the perfect something. The perfect something.
I don't know the name that they call it, but I think you're right. You're onto something there. The perfect adjustment?
Something like that. And it really is very effective to just put them in the right place. If I can just dial back a little bit here, I think it'd be a good time to talk about, I'm sure you guys have talked about this before, but just to touch on, we keep mentioning cognitive load, and I'm not sure if we've mentioned chunking today. You guys, I'm sure you've talked about that before.
No. Chunking?
I think we've brought it up. I'm definitely familiar with the concept, right? You're talking about basically how the brain can make connections if you absorb certain bits of information kind of chunked together in like a maximal size packet. Is that what you're talking about?
Sort of. So just the idea of cognitive load in the sense of how many ideas you can hold or how many details you can hold in your short-term memory at a given time. And then chunking would be sort of the practical application of cognitive load. So basically across the board, the average person, there are a lot of studies on this and different numbers, but the average person can hold about 4 things in their mind, their short-term memory, at once. So that would be an example of a chunk. So if I want to demonstrate a particular sequence, I'm going to go with 4. If it's like a big class, I'll go with 4. I might recognize that if a student's particularly young, we don't have anyone really younger than about 5, but sometimes 5-year-olds, they might need a single detail. Like I might just say frame, but usually it's about 4. So the cognitive load of the average person is approximately 4. Some people, it's crazy. Like they can have tons of detail in their mind at once, and some people it's fewer. But just having that number of 4, even 3, I kind of like. And definitely no more than about 7. And that's really how much detail. I mean, I know it's kind of hard to break down what you're saying into like, is that 3 elements or 4 elements? But you can kind of guess. And then you create a chunk. So I teach some little piece of information that's about a block of about 4 details or a concept with 2 other details. Then they start working on that. Now that they've consolidated that chunk into a single element of their short-term memory, I can build on that chunk and fill in those other gaps.
Yeah, that's why if you're going to a seminar and the instructor is trying to like cram 10 different techniques into one seminar, probably he's doing it wrong, right? I think that you need to keep this kind of stuff in mind in terms of the number of things that you can put into someone's head in order to get maximal value. And I mean, I've personally used similar memory tricks to try to retain knowledge when I go to one of these lessons. Like I will, for example, if I'm at some seminar and the instructor is just rattling off techniques. I mean, it's not the greatest approach, but heck, I paid for it. So I want to get value out of it. Rather than trying to remember at all times all of the things he's saying, I'll just try to remember a number. So if he shows 7 techniques, I'll remember in my head the number 7. And then a day later, after the seminar, I'll remember that number 7 and I will sit down and I'll try to manually extract from my brain and write out the specific 7 techniques and the steps for doing them. So by doing that, it's kind of like forcing myself to do spaced repetition.
Yeah, and that's retrieval practice.
Exactly.
Exactly, retrieval practice, yeah.
Yeah. Now, in an ideal world, the instructor would not create the situation where that is required. So the best thing that you can do as an instructor is to manage the cognitive load of your students and make sure that you don't overwhelm them with details. I mean, I know that there's kind of this weird thing where many gyms have kind of centered around this like 3 techniques a day thing that just seems to sort of be the benchmark. I even feel that that's too much. I mean, my instructors have kind of dropped that down to sort of centralize on like 1, maybe 2 concepts per day. Cause you go beyond that and you're really kind of stretching how much stuff you can cram into someone's head, especially if they're white belts or if they're very, very junior.
Yeah, I definitely do not go into 3 separate techniques in a day, but I'll have the students start with drilling something in particular at the beginning. Typically, I'll start with a drill. It could be something else. I like to switch the classes up really frequently and kind of keep them guessing. But then as the class progresses, I'm connecting the new information to existing information, which is a form of elaboration, one of the learning strategies, and then having them play games where they're integrating the new information into, again, pre-existing information. So when I say, just to make sure this is pretty clear, like I'm definitely not doing 3 separate techniques with different levels of detail to each technique. I'm talking like a few details on a single technique or concept.
Yeah, then definitely keeping it simple is I think, again, sort of the concept that we're talking about here, because I would way rather my junior or senior kid students go home and have one thing that they learned rather than me trying to cram 3 to 5 things in their head. And then they really don't learn anything properly. It's just,
yeah.
It's more me being an instructor trying to flex my knowledge at the end of the day rather than actually trying to get something across to them.
One thing that's actually an interesting mental model that comes up in the artificial intelligence realm is this concept of transfer learning, which is basically where when you're training a computer, it can use the knowledge that it gains in one discipline to learn another discipline. And the interesting thing is it looks like human beings actually learn in similar ways. And this is something that John Thomas talked about on the episode that he did with us, where he talked about how sometimes if you want to get better, rather than trying to laser focus on one thing, it's good to try other things, because by learning in one discipline, your brain can apply that knowledge in other disciplines as well and make you stronger across the board. So that's important when you're teaching, because it implies that it's better to shake it up and to give some variety in your classes. And that's why I think that a common mistake instructors make is they'll have a theme for a month or two where they'll have arm bars for 1 month and they're just doing little rote variations of the same technique over and over again for an extended period of time. And I feel like it might be a more productive approach to add variability.
Yeah, so, I mean, that's not an effective form of retrieval if you're doing the same thing all the time, because you're not having to use much effort in that retrieval process. This reminds me of something I read a while back. I'm not sure if this is entirely true across the board, but basically in a traditional public school system, at least here in Canada, and I'm pretty sure in the States, you learn different topics completely separate from one another. And as I understand it, in, for instance, a Montessori model, you'll learn a topic, like you'll be doing music, and then you'll learn the history of music, and you'll learn the science behind music, and it's all connected in that way. And that, like, connecting, like you mentioned, by doing something else and coming back to what you were doing, it can help you to learn more effectively. So just considering that model of sort of that Montessori versus a typical public school approach, where you're just relating various things, it just makes that learning process so much easier.
Awesome. Yeah. So on that topic, I know that something else that you guys are eager to talk about, promotion strategy for kids. Cal, I'd really like to pick your brain about belt testing and promotion strategies for your kids' class.
So, I could say up front that, man, I've put a lot of work into the process of teaching and how to make these kids as good as possible, as quickly as possible, and for them to have a good time. But man, when it comes to specific belt testing and that sort of thing, I can't say I could grow in that area quite a bit. What I will say is testing, I don't like using testing, and I'm not the person who came up with this, but using testing as a form of evaluation. I use testing as a form of retrieval practice. So I'll have, depending on the student, typically this student has to be a little bit more advanced, but I'll say, all right, guys, we're going to have a bit of a quiz class today, and it'll be, okay, show me a hand fighting sequence. All right, perfect. Show me a tripod sweep. All right, what's a nice follow-up to the tripod sweep? Excellent. All right, what's happening? Like, why is this working? Name a concept for me. So in that sense, I'm doing quizzing or testing, and I am evaluating the students and their level of knowledge, but I don't at all put them in a situation where it's like, you're coming to class today to do a test to show me that you're capable of whatever that belt is. And I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I think there are merits to obviously different ways of doing things, but that's how I do things.
Yeah, and I think the testing format for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is, it's kind of a two-way street. I know, Cal, you were somebody that I talked to pre-COVID times when I was trying to actually design a kid's belt test. I was thinking, like, I'm not a big fan of belt tests either. I've done them as an adult, and we don't do them for adults at all, and I don't really believe in them. But they do have, I think, some value when it comes to kids, because, jiu-jitsu is such a vast art. There is so much to learn, and I think that it is good to almost have either homework, or I think the term that we kind of settled on was, we kind of called it a playbook rather than a test, because and I know Rob's not hot on the idea. He sort of looks at the test or what a test is as a pass or fail thing. My intention to having a test would not necessarily be a pass or fail thing. It would be more, okay, you're given this booklet, whether you're, I wrote a test for the gray, yellow, orange, and green belts. And it was more, at the end of the day, the way that I was applying it was more of a playbook where I was envisioning, maybe a month or 2 or even 3 months before a kid is maybe ready to get their belt. I would give them this playbook, and it would have, I'm just going to pull it up right here. It would have all different types of ways to express their knowledge. So there'd be a theoretical portion. So for example, I can just rattle off a few things here, like the gray belt test. So the very first belt you would get after white belt, I had a theory section. So there would be, questions that are kind of unrelated to jiu-jitsu, more related to character building. So a few things I have written down is like, what is dedication? What is ownership? What is a guard? What is a sweep? What is a takedown? What is a goal? What is a strategy for reaching goals? Why is losing important, etc. So like character building. And then I had then they would have to do a practical where they would have to demonstrate particular solo movements. These would be examples of this would be like heisting, hip escaping, butt scooting, forward roll, break fall, all this stuff. And then there would be techniques that they would need to perform on a uke. And then actually for this test, I actually have miscellaneous stuff. So they would have to tie their belt in front of me. They would have to explain how and why we shake hands. They'd have to tell me one thing they like about jiu-jitsu, one thing they don't like about jiu-jitsu. And then the test, regardless of belt, always ends with a situational sparring. So this is like, I don't like the pass or fail sort of situation. The way that I envisioned it is the kids would come in and, they would have had this playbook for a few months, and these are the moves you need to show. And if you don't know these moves, you either need to ask me about it in class, or you need to, look on YouTube and sort of study on your own, right? And then this way, one sort of hidden value with this is that the parents might get involved, and then they can have a deeper understanding of what the kids are going through, and sort of what they're learning and why they do the things they do. Because I'm sure to a lot of the untrained eye of the parents, they don't know what they're looking at, right? Like they might know what guard is, but they don't know any of the strategies that are going on. They just know to cheer for their kids obnoxiously from the sidelines sometimes, right? So I like this idea. Again, this was something that I sort of put together pre-COVID, and I haven't put into practice yet, but it's something that I'm thinking about doing, is just sort of like giving them a playbook, much like I played football for 1 year as a kid. And, at the beginning of the season, the first half of the season was practice. Second half of the season, you start playing games. And the whole first half of the season is just like going over plays. And they literally give you a playbook that shows, because you need to have these plays so that you know where you're going to go and when they call what play you're going to do, right? So I sort of likened it to that.
Yeah, a lot of good points there. I would definitely like to put together some kind of a bit of an instructional material for those students, for the kids, and having them communicate with their parents is huge. If they can have discussions with their parents, typically any kids in my class whose parents also train, man, it's definitely not a coincidence that those kids really excel. Although there are kids that don't have parents in the class that also excel. But just that ability and that connection between the parents and the kids, man, that's huge. And that's a big element of how I deal with, kids that might be more challenging in class. I typically will communicate with the parents before I really do much directly with the kids and try to find out, if there's a reason behind whatever the kids are doing. I don't typically overtly ask them questions like, what was it you said at the very beginning there, at the beginning of your testing? You asked a particular question?
So it was, the beginning is sort of it's a theoretical sort of portion of the test where, the tests change as I've written them, because the gray belt is obviously kind of the first promotion. So it was more so questions of character, like, what is a goal? Why, right. What do you like about jiu-jitsu? What don't you like about jiu-jitsu? Like, why do we shake hands? These types of things. But as the tests progress, I started to add a conceptual theory portion where it would be like, okay, explain to me posture, or, I know that one of your criticisms was of the idea of testing is that the kids start to regurgitate rather than learn. Maybe I could explain what posture means, and then these kids are literally going to regurgitate what I say back to me in the test. And that's not really what I want. But what I could say is, or what I could do during the practical part, is I would put them in a position and say, okay, show me good posture from this position, because posture structure base changes. It's relative to the goals and the nature of the situation. So, I could put them in a position and say, okay, like, how would you create good structure from this position? Are your structures broken from this position, or do you have good structures? And sort of that way they would know, yes, they do need to know on paper what posture structure base means, but they also need to apply it in a real situation. So they're not just regurgitating my definitions, but they're actually able to problem solve and show it, and start to see it in any given situation.
Yeah, I like to ask a lot of open-ended questions so that the concepts that they come back at me with aren't just regurgitation. I don't want to make the concepts cliche. And so I like to ask really open-ended questions, and then they can kind of come together, even as a group, to find the right answer to a given question. Now, just touching on the idea of character development, I think the main thing that I do in regards to character development really all comes back to teaching the students how to be good training partners. To me, really, like, fundamentally, I like to think of myself as teaching jiu-jitsu. I'm teaching nothing else, but jiu-jitsu can teach them plenty of things that they need to learn. So in teaching them to be a good training partner, those are the kinds of skills that will translate outside of the gym. But it's just sort of the way I approach it. I don't know if it's a lack of experience or comfort in just sort of directly addressing certain things with kids and asking them those questions about character. I like to kind of just incorporate it within the lesson and how to be a good training partner. And that's typically, how you end up being a decent person.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that character and integrity are highly undervalued aspects of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, not just for kids, but for adults as well. I mean, there are a lot of people who get to black belt and they still really don't demonstrate what I would consider to be the requisite character to act as an ambassador to the community. And this, I think, is an area where it would be really nice if we cared about that to the same extent that we cared about just your individual skill. And I think that one of the great things about any martial art, and that includes jiu-jitsu, is its ability as a vehicle to build good habits and to build character. And yeah, you have a great example, whereas, learning the specific mechanics of jiu-jitsu may not make you a better person, but it is a vehicle and a driver to kickstart those processes and to build discipline and to teach you respect. And that in itself makes it a super valuable activity for the young. So Cal, back onto the topic of learning strategies, what other techniques have you discovered for working with kids?
So we went over effortful retrieval, cognitive load, and chunking. The next few that I regularly use, so blocked practice versus an interleaved practice. This is a really common learning strategy people talk about. A blocked practice, it just means doing the same thing over and over for a given period of time, versus an interleaved practice, which means doing one thing and then a different thing and then a different thing and just sort of circling back eventually to the first thing you did. So blocked practice can typically be useful if either you're very advanced and you need a lot of details on a particular position because it's going to challenge you cognitively because you're going to have a bunch of details, or if you're particularly new and you need to learn something you never learned before, that's going to be challenging. So we're going to just do a basic blocked practice for that. But an interleaved practice, the real benefits to interleaving your practice has to do with the idea that you're regularly bringing existing ideas into your short-term memory. So it's like, okay, I'll practice a tripod sweep, okay? And I'll do that a few times. And then I'll move into something else, like maybe a Toriando pass. Usually these are things that you've previously learned. This isn't new information. That's where you'd use that blocked practice. And so this practice of bringing new information into your short-term memory has proven to be very effective in long-term, more durable learning. Some studies have been done comparing blocked and interleaved practice, and basically what it shows is people typically want to do a blocked practice because they feel as though they're getting better at a skill in the short term, and an interleaved practice makes them feel as though, man, like I'm not getting much better at this skill right now. I feel like I could really stick to it a lot longer. But in the long run, down the road, people who do the interleaved practice typically perform better in a test environment. And the reason that people believe this is true is because they're more accustomed to bringing information into their short-term memory and using that retrieval practice once again.
Yeah. And I kind of wonder to what extent that's actually tied to transfer learning, where by getting exposed to all of these new ideas, you're able to see the patterns between them. I think if nothing else, it definitely keeps you more engaged. And as you discussed, it forces you to continually bring these items back into your short-term memory.
Exactly.
Additionally, it's just a lot more fun.
That too.
I think this is a big deviation from the way that most instructors structure their programs, where they've got a month of arm bars or a month of guard or whatever. I think that just constantly shaking it up makes things both more interesting and more efficient for learning.
Now, yeah, I completely agree, but the key detail here is I'm trying as best I can to bring information back to the students before they forget it. So it is random in a sense, but it's also not random at all, because it seems random maybe to the student, but as the instructor, I want to make sure we touch on something before the student forgets it. A lot of analogies here, like I've heard of one where it's like you're cooking and you have food in a pan. You need to stir the food frequently or it's going to burn to the pan. It's the same idea with sort of learning a new technique or a new skill. If you don't stir it, it's useless.
Who taught you that shit? That's not true.
The cook.
I mean, it depends. Not to go down a rabbit hole, but like if you were to add a steak to a hot pan and then move it around a bunch, you wouldn't get that sear and it would stick. So I mean, just like jiu-jitsu, there's tons of exceptions. But let's not go down the culinary rabbit hole. You triggered me.
Yeah, you're the wrong guy to bring this up with. All right, I'll move into two more learning strategies that complement each other as well. And these kind of sound similar to the last two, but they are a bit different. So it's just constant practice versus a varied practice. This is something I'm sure everybody does, but just to put a name on it will help you categorize it. So a constant practice basically just means whatever repetition you're doing, your training partner is giving you the same feedback every time. Okay, I'm sure you can imagine when this would be useful and when it wouldn't. A varied practice is just essentially, it's situational drilling or, micro sparring, whatever you want to call it, where your training partner is giving you variable resistance. So you're training a particular movement. Maybe it's a guard pass. In the constant version, you're doing the exact same thing over and over again. In the varied version, they're switching up how they're going to defend that particular pass. All right. So just constant versus varied. It's not complicated at all, but they're just super useful tools. And we always bring it back to this idea of effortful retrieval, retrieving things before they just kind of disappear.
This is a really great example, and also something that is important as an adult to learn, because when you're an adult, you sort of gravitate towards your A game. And you'll see this happen a lot, where if you've got two guys and you just have them spar a standard jiu-jitsu match, they're both going to just gravitate to whatever it is they're particularly good at and most comfortable with. And that of course makes sense, because, when you're in the middle of a sparring match, your mind may not want to allow you to use techniques that you're not particularly good at. You're going to favor things that you're good at. So you kind of need to shuffle the deck if you want to encourage learning. You need to put people in situational positions where they can't play the game that they want to play. So maybe you've got a guy who always pulls guard. Well, if you just let them spar, he's always going to wind up on the bottom. So to really get good, you've got to create situations where he's got to go on top and pass. And a big part of encouraging people to break out of their existing habits and to learn new things is to create these situational moments where they have to use new things, because otherwise they'll fall back to what they know.
Yeah, and that's great for adults as well. Like I have some guys that are, really good in one aspect, but not very advanced in other aspects. So sometimes I have to go to them and be like, hey, this month, you're not allowed to do any submissions, or you're not allowed to do any footlocks. Like you have to focus on not getting your guard pass. That's your number one. And vice versa. I have other guys that are not quite up to date with leg locks. It's like, okay, the only thing I want you to do is find entrances to the legs. Like I don't want you to focus on smashing people or playing your A game. I want you to focus on the things that you're not good at.
Yeah, and definitely. And I mean, I use these strategies with the adult classes as well. I teach the adults pretty much daily as well. But just with the kids, it's such basic material and they're such beginner learners that really, once someone hits a particular level, I find that, they're going to figure out how they learn on their own, and they're going to kind of pick that path. And obviously as a coach, you're going to try help guide them no matter what level they are. But just bringing it back to like, these are absolute beginners, like super beginners that I'm typically trying to consider this information for. So when it comes to like I don't know, constant versus varied. With an advanced player, you could just have them focus on, like, you'd have them use these particular strategies dependent on their experience level with that particular thing. But with a kid, their experience level with everything is virtually zero, right? So how to kind of use these in your favor for that particular demographic.
Right on.
Let me just jump into, I think we talked about elaboration, like, really briefly.
Yeah.
But elaboration, it's actually a pretty deep learning strategy. There's a lot to it, but as far as I understand it, it has to do with connecting. So I can connect new techniques to existing techniques that the kids know. I can ask the kids questions about other sports that they play and relate those sports to jiu-jitsu. I can ask them questions about basic day-to-day things and the kind of posture they might assume if they want to pick up something heavy, whatever it might be. That's elaboration.
I use that all the time when I talk about picking up a heavy box or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. It's such a good basic intro to alignment, essentially. Finally, let me get to just modeling, this idea of modeling as a learning strategy. So it's very simple. If I'm demonstrating a technique, usually I have an uke there. Shout out to Corey Burton, hell of an uke, hell of a training partner. He helps with the kids' classes, and he does a phenomenal job relating to the kids. And I think that's it's just such an important thing when the kids come to class and they're like, "Where's Corey at?" You know, they're just super excited.
Yeah.
So that element is just super key. I had to definitely throw a shout out in there. But modeling. So when we're demonstrating a technique, the kids, sometimes I know they're not paying attention, you know, like they're not listening, that is, but they're looking at you. Their head might be out in the clouds, and, you know, I try to refocus them, but either way, sometimes I've demonstrated a technique and I recognize that the kids are not doing what I told them to do. They're doing what they saw, right? So it seems pretty obvious, but when you demonstrate a technique, you really have to have flawless technique as the people demonstrating, because the kids are going to mirror whatever it is you're doing. So I just think it's obvious, but it's super important to mention that you need to be a model in the class for the behavior that you expect from the kids.
And that goes beyond just jiu-jitsu and into the way that you conduct yourself off the mats as well, or even just when you're having conversation. It is a very, very underrated part of being an instructor, to be a good role model. And not just for kids. I mean, for adults too, you'd think, well, we're all grown-ups. We don't need our instructor to be a role model. But it makes a huge difference, because if nothing else, the instructor sets the culture of the gym. And if the instructor doesn't care or doesn't actively take ownership of the culture and make it a positive place to train, then usually things fall apart. So if nothing else, it's very important for the instructor to mirror the good habits and good behavior that they want the rest of their students to see. And that's beyond just making sure that they do techniques properly.
Yeah, and even just being like upbeat and positive, kids respond so well to that. Like they will, that sort of positive energy. I mean, again, it makes sense because kids are also humans, but it works the same way with adults as well. Like I think with the kids, you have to be a little bit more bubbly, I guess is the word. Like the younger they go, you know, you kind of have to be more of treating them, you know, more like kids. But positivity is something that all ages pick up on. You know, if you're not happy to be there as an instructor, then it's just not going to be a good time for anyone. But you
have to be having a good time.
Exactly. Like, but if you
absolutely have to.
But if you really show the kids, hey, like I'm enjoying this, like it's cool to enjoy this. It's cool for everyone to be in here training. And even, you know, you fall down. I don't know about you, but like regularly, you know, we'll have kids cry, and it's just kind of part of it, mostly in the junior kids class, but it's just part of it. And that is such a crucial growing opportunity, because they can, a lot of the time they just, you know, they'll have their little episode or whatever. And then, you know, they'll need to sit, and then I'll come by and talk to them, and then I'll give them, you know, kind of a pep talk, like, okay, like let's get back on the horse, let's go in there. And then they get in, and then at the end of the class, I reiterate with them, like, you see, you could do it. Like you had an issue there, you know, maybe you got hurt or whatever, but then you shook it off, and I'm super proud of you for trying your best there. And then they come away thinking like, oh wow, like I was able to overcome adversity there, you know.
Yeah, something that I think a lot of instructors do wrong is, yes, they're passionate about jujitsu, but that's not enough. You have to also demonstrate that you're passionate about teaching and you're passionate about your students. I think a lot of people who take on jujitsu as a professional career, you kind of get the impression that they don't really want to teach. It's just that teaching is the way that they pay the bills to do what they really want, which is jujitsu. And it sometimes feels like they really couldn't care less about the success or failure of their students. And I think most of us have probably had an instructor in their lives at some point who is like this. And the thing that really sets top tier instructors apart is you can tell they really care about their students, both in the way that they conduct themselves with enthusiasm, but with that great example, Matt, that you gave, where they take an individual interest in helping their students overcome and helping them be better. And especially with kids, that's just, as a parent, I know this is just so important to do and such a good practice.
Yeah, I just want to reinforce that idea that if you're showing up to a class, not only are they paying, with money, they're paying with their time as well. You have the attention of a group of people, whether they're adults or kids. Like it's honestly just absurd to me that you wouldn't spend that time as an instructor doing your best to create the best possible environment. It should be a good time. It should be high level instruction and skill. Like, these things should be pretty straightforward. Like, if we're a professional sport or professional art, however you want to look at it, that should go without saying, But obviously it doesn't. But man, it's incredibly important.
Mm-hmm. When you teach kids, Cal, like, what is your objective that you want for the kids? Do you want them to become? Obviously, we want them to become better people, right? But do you want them to become like champion grapplers? Do you want them to just learn jujitsu and self-defense? Do you sort of go with it and sort of, if you see someone who's exceptionally talented, you sort of, and they're interested in competition, you'll maybe focus that sort of angle on them. Whereas another kid who, isn't as talented or is undisciplined, you focus discipline on them more than anything. Like, what is your objective for kids when you go in and teach every day?
It's definitely subjective. Depending on how long I've known a particular student, I'm able to cater those goals more specifically to that individual. But overall, to me, it's this idea of kind of having jujitsu with you everywhere you go, no matter what you do. That's what I'd like for any kid or adult who sticks with the program. That takes time. That takes years. And I'd like for any student that really sticks around for any period of time, I think of it as having, jujitsu in your back pocket. It's like you have a sense of so many things. I don't think I need to break those things down, but that's kind of really my only goal. I want the kids to have a really good time in class. I'd like to believe that we can have a great time while doing something that benefits us and that's effective. And I don't see why that's, not the reality of it.
Mm-hmm. I think fun, again, it parallels kids and adults. But it definitely for kids, it's got to be fun. And it is fun a lot of the time. And even when you get hurt, it can be fun as long as you learn something from it and character is built from it. But definitely more kids will be flooding back to schools if they enjoy it. And they're not going to fight with their parents if they enjoy it. They're just going to go in and I find a lot of the time when they enjoy it, it's a lot easier to get information to stick.
Yeah, it's funny. I've had, in the past, I had one kid that I remember, and he was like, we were going through something. He's like, man, like, this isn't fun, and I'm thinking like, damn, like this kid is right. This, whatever we're doing right now, I need to restructure this because you're totally right. This should be fun,
Yeah.
Yeah. And I know that there's this big mentality because I think, a lot of jujitsu gyms are opened by people who come from a competitive jujitsu background. And so that's the lens through which they see the world. And, maybe they are willing to sacrifice it all to win on the podium, but not everyone wants that out of jujitsu. And in fact, most of the people who help the instructors pay the bills probably don't want that. So fun is such a powerful motivator for jiu-jitsu, especially in the early days of the hobby when this thing is scary and foreign and confusing. It's different if you've been doing it for, 8 to 10 years, because at that point you've kind of made the commitment that this is going to be a part of your life. But to get people in the door, you have to demonstrate that this is something that people can enjoy. And I would argue that even at the top schools, which are very competitive focused, being fun and having fun is such an important part of keeping morale and motivation high.
I mean, yeah, I absolutely agree. There's a book called The Inner Game of Tennis Really enjoy it. Don't know if you read it, but it talks about this idea of self one and self two. So self one is your calculated mind, and self two is more your intuition. And the book basically talks about this idea that there are certain skills that we can practice that might not win us medals on a podium, but they will help us to more so enjoy our lives, and so structuring a training, a room with that in mind. Don't get me wrong. There are absolutely going to be champions in your class, and there are going to be kids who want to be pushed and kids who need to be pushed. But overall, I think we're just kind of reiterating the same thing, of course it has to be fun.
Yeah, for sure. And it's amazing. Jiu-jitsu is one of those things, just because it's you can listen to all the different things that you've mentioned today, different learning models and whatnot. Like jiu-jitsu is one of those activities where you learn jiu-jitsu and it gives you so many awesome tools for other sports, job, how you approach your career, how you solve problems, how you organize your time, how you look at risk versus reward and action and consequence and things like that. It is truly a remarkable thing. And you can totally see, I have a lot of parents come to me and say, since my kids started doing jujitsu, like they've been really good in this area of life, or they've been paying way more attention in class. I don't want to be inappropriate here, but it's like a lot of time it's boys that need this action. They need to be able to go to a place where they can safely wrestle and get that aggression out. And it's amazing how it affects their life positively in other ways.
And have a girl their same age kick the shit out of them.
Dude, it is one of my favorite things to watch is a girl beat the shit out of a boy.
It happens all the time.
It happens all the time because they're at a point, when they haven't reached puberty yet, where it's like there's still no physical advantage yet. There's no strength advantage from the boy. At a certain age, I feel like, when they hit puberty, just the muscle mass and the bone density just can't be denied. But definitely for kids, up to 10 years old and even a few years after, you're going to see quite often girls kick the shit out of guys. And I actually find that girls are usually better learners than boys in general. Like they pay attention to the details more. And I find that they try not to goof around as much anyways.
I've had a similar experience. I think that's an age thing. And just to add a tiny bit to when you were talking about what, kids or adults get out of jiu-jitsu. And I think that making sort of an uncomfortable situation the norm is something that happens so frequently in jiu-jitsu. Kids are learning to play while they're sort of fighting. They're learning how to draw this line between we're playing a game, but we're trying to kill each other, and they're in positions where they're really uncomfortable frequently, but they get super comfortable with that discomfort. I mean, how many life skills are more important than that?
Yeah, that's a specific mental model that we talk about on the show, the notion of growth from discomfort, and how all growth comes from pushing beyond your comfort zone and into things that you're not good at or you're not comfortable with. That kind of stress inoculation is very important. When people say that jiu-jitsu gives confidence and it'll make you better in the other areas of your life, where the mind goes is, I'm a badass and I can beat up my boss. But you know what? That's stupid. The reason why jiu-jitsu gives you confidence in other areas of life is because it teaches you to be comfortable in uncomfortable situations, and it teaches you that you can overcome them and thrive and learn from them. And there's not much more uncomfortable than someone sitting on you trying to submit you, right? So jiu-jitsu is, in that reason, it's a very powerful learning tool. I think the reason why it's such a good confidence builder is not because it makes you think you're this badass, but it's because it teaches you to get comfortable in stressful situations.
Yeah, I got one question for you, Cal. Have you ever had or heard of one of your students getting into an altercation at school or outside of school and they used jiu-jitsu?
Yes.
I had that for the first time pre-COVID and I was so fucking proud. It was awesome. Dude, and the kid,
so cool.
And it was done in a safe manner.
Same.
It was controlled, and it was also a bully who has a bit of a reputation and was 2 years elder to the kid who was able to take them down and mount them. If I'm not mistaken, it was a blast double and then mounted and held there while everyone was watching. And it's like, man, that is just such an amazing thing, especially when we live in a time where basically kids are encouraged not to fight and encouraged not to sort out problems, but go get a teacher, right? And then, of course, the story that I keep hearing from these parents is the teachers don't do shit. They don't, there's not much they can do. If they're there, they can do something, but how often is that going to happen, And if they go to the principal, then often the principal kind of gives them the runaround and says, oh, well, there's not really much we can do. So it's like, man, putting your kid in jiu-jitsu, it gives them that tool to be able to kind of self-police the playground, and when I heard that happened, I was so proud. And to hear that he didn't, there was no excessive force, it was controlled, it was disciplined, and it was just, and that was just something so awesome. And it felt like when you hear stories like that, just everything becomes so worth it.
Oh man. Yeah. I feel the exact same way. Really similar story on my end where this one kid was just constantly dealing with a bully, and it was a long-term thing. Like, I think this was like year 2 of this being an issue. And in this one circumstance, he gave the kid, 3 or 4 warnings, and same kind of deal, just absolutely dominated the guy without really hurting him. And I'd like to add to that, I don't typically give speeches in my classes, or really like tell the kids anything. Like I said, I like them to learn through jiu-jitsu. I find that it teaches them what they need to learn. But I'll tell you what, when I have a parent come in and tell me that one of their kids, is dealing with bullying, oh man, like I will go off. I've had some pretty passionate talks with my kids, and I just make it so important that they know that it's so important that there's a line. You are totally a respectful person. There's no reason that you need to exert force on another person almost ever. But if someone is in your space and you've given them every opportunity, man, like you don't take that for a split second,
Got to take control of it.
That is something that I think is a mistake in the way that bully response has been traditionally taught. And I will credit the Gracie programs for correcting this, which is it used to always be that just ignore bullies and they'll go away. That is terrible life advice. They will not go away. It will only embolden them. Yeah. So there comes, of course you want to de-escalate. You should always de-escalate first and foremost, but there is a point of no return where you have to fight back and protect yourself. And that's where jiu-jitsu is so powerful. And, as a black belt now, now I understand why we say position over submission, because of course, when you start off, you get caught up in these fancy submissions and you think about how awesome it would be to armbar or choke someone. But let me tell you, there is no greater humiliation for a bully than having someone sit on their chest for 5 minutes and just look at them disappointedly and lecture them. That is way more damaging than choking them or armbarring them. Like, positional dominance is a level of power that submissions don't have, because it demonstrates that I could hurt you, but I choose not to. And that allows you not just to win, but to take the higher ground, which sends such a powerful message to the bully.
So awesome. I love jiu-jitsu.
And just to jump on your point about position before submission, obviously alignment over everything, right? And when you think about alignment as a tool for teaching kids, man, if a person walks around with the right alignment, a bully does not approach that type of person, and so that's just a simple thing where kids learn, like, oh, that's how I'm supposed to stand. Oh, like, this is how I'm supposed to use my body, and that cue is going to show other kids that, like, look, this person, you can tell by their body language that they're comfortable in their own skin. And that's the first step.
Yeah, when I'm walking down the street, I'm always walking with a strong elbow-knee connection and a stagger stance, so I can shoot that blast double on anyone who comes near me.
That's not what I mean,
Steve. No, I know what you mean. One other thing I'd like to add is, you mentioned earlier that a lot of the time, and this is a very common pattern, the kid comes into the class and the parent drops them off and they sit there and watch on the sidelines. But then there's that one day where the parent is like, you know what? I want to give this a try. And one thing that we didn't touch on is the power of jiu-jitsu as a family bonding activity, because I've got a lot of, child-parent pairs who train, and it gives them something. It gives them a connection that grown-ups and kids often don't get in the real world, right? I remember, and Matt, I'm sure that you remember when we were kids, like whatever mom and dad did was like this weird mystery that a kid can't possibly understand. Like I know they go to work, but I don't know what that means. I have no point of reference to connect with my parents, but jiu-jitsu allows kids to connect with their parents in a way that they're not going to get just by living life in their standard like roles. That just doesn't exist. But jujitsu is like a bridge between those two worlds that brings them together and lets you connect with your kid in a new and interesting way.
For sure. And that's why anytime I can, I try and involve the parents as well. And, not a lot of the parents that have kids in my program, not a lot of them train. But definitely doing things like, for example, that playbook that we discussed where we take them home and the parents can kind of walk them through it and sort of see what's going to be expected of them. They can see not only how jujitsu works on a different level, but also they get the value out of it. They see, okay, like I am getting a lot of value out of this on different levels, not just physically learning how to defend yourself, but also like life lessons and character development and things like that. As it goes on, like into the green belts, like the concepts were pretty much the same concepts that I would teach adults. Again, it brings it all back to a healthy mix between conceptual, the techniques, but also the character development. And that is, like you said, Steve, it's so, it's underappreciated, I think, in a lot of situations. And I think sometimes, if I'm being totally honest, overappreciated. I think some schools totally focus on that and don't teach enough of actually how jujitsu works to kids.
The longer I do this, the more I realize that the least important thing about jujitsu is the actual jujitsu. Jujitsu is just kind of this vehicle that lets you do all of these other really, really important things. I have a story, actually. Matt, you'll probably like this. So we've got a mutual acquaintance named Philippe, who's an instructor here in the Vancouver area. And I've got a coworker whose kid trains with Philippe. And it's like an 8-year-old son. And so one day this dad, my coworker, is asking his son, hey, can you show me what you learned in jiu-jitsu today? And his 8-year-old son double-legged him and held him in side control. And the guy was telling me at work, he was like, I couldn't get out.
I thought you were going to say wrist lock.
Well, it is Philippe. I know he's fond of those.
That's
cool.
funny. I have a really similar story to that where a kid went home and I guess they're hanging out in their kitchen and his mom was like, oh yeah, like, so what'd you learn at your, basically your karate today type thing. He's like, oh, like, let me show you. Like I was on my back and I held the ankle and I put my foot on the hip and then he just tripod sweeps her right in the middle of the kitchen. I hope he stood up holding the ankle.
But did he come up for his two?
Yeah,
did he come up for his two?
I hope he controlled the ankle.
Exactly. You got to have that lever control.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I think this was just an unreal chat. I really enjoyed it, Cal. Thank you so much for your time. Are there any closing thoughts here before we tie this up?
I think we touched on a lot. So I really appreciate you guys having me on. This is a lot of fun.
Awesome. Anything you want to plug before we tie it up?
Oh, not so much, no. I mean, maybe in the future.
Well, if you want to give us money, you can go to patreon.com/BJJMentalModels. That's the best way for any of you to support the show. From there, as I think most of you know, we have a variety of different perks and benefits for patrons, including things like narrated roles. One of the things that I know Matt and I have been doing is getting footage from our patrons and providing concept-based feedback. It's been just a blast to do, and it's also been really valuable to them. So again, if this is something that you want to dig deeper into, the mental model aspect of jiu-jitsu, please do consider signing up at patreon.com/BJJMentalModels. Again, Cal, thank you so much for your time. I'd love to have you back in the future. There's just so much you can talk about on this subject matter. And I think it's just such a valuable way to think when it comes to how you teach kids, because, I think a lot of people might think, oh, well, teaching kids, that's not my job. That's not what I do. So how is this relevant to me? But I think one thing that came out of this episode is an understanding that, kids are kind of like just one specific example of very powerful techniques that you can apply in any area of life where it comes to instruction or leadership. So this was a super helpful chat for me, and I certainly hope it was for our listeners as well. So again, Cal, thank you very much.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you, guys.
I got to say, this is one of my favorite chats I think we've ever done. And Cal, for sure, please come back. Let's do a part 2 because we really only started scratching the surface. This is a vast topic. I think a lot of instructors listening could get a lot of value out of it. And I certainly got a lot of value out of it. And again, just to reiterate what Steve said, thanks again to the patrons for the support. Really appreciate it. And if you're in the Nanaimo area, if you're looking to get some world-class jiu-jitsu as an adult or for your kids, please check out Island Top Team. Cal does a fantastic job with the kids. And of course, do you teach adults as well, Cal? You do?
I do. I teach the adults basically once every day.
Right. So you also, Cal teaches adult classes. And of course, Rob is sort of the the mastermind behind the whole alignment concept. So definitely check out Island Top Team if you're in Nanaimo. And thanks for listening, guys. And thank you, Cal, for being on the show.
Thank you guys very much. That was a lot of fun, and I love talking about this stuff, so I'll happily come back on.
All right. Take care, everyone. Thank you again.
Bye.